wonderful drink of water in the desert, huh? So the other day, I found myself in a cafe, and there was something on the television that I think really captures the essence of the kind of tragedy that we find ourselves in today. A woman working there had MSNBC on, which is sort of the left-wing equivalent of what the views you'll get on, say, Fox News or something. And so one of the discussions that was coming up, they were talking about the new Congress that was going to be coming in, the new leadership that was going to be coming in the Congress. And one of the things they brought up was that you're going to see this change in the chairmanship of, for example, the House Committee on Science and Technology. And they are all up in arms and flustered about the fact that the two names are being floated to take over the Science Committee, the Science and Technology Committee, were Dana Rohrabacher, who's, many people know, is from the Huntington area, Huntington Beach, California, and this other guy, Ralph Hall, who's from Texas. Now, the point they're making, they said, well, look at Rohrabacher, he's a global warming denier. He's a denier. And even worse is this guy, Ralph Hall, who goes as far as to say that man has no impact on the environment. And so they're ripping out saying, gee, what a bunch of Luddites these two are. Now, of course, someone like Rohrabacher is a big proponent of things like nuclear power, high-speed rail, etc. And yes, he denies that there is this phenomenon which is known as global warming. And yes, Ralph Hall will say man has no impact on the environment. And so you say, well, gee, either you agree with that or you disagree. So then what's the other view? That's insane. Of course man has an impact on the environment. He has a very bad impact on the environment, right? He spews all kinds of carbon dioxide into the air, heats the environment, kills rivers, kills forests. And then that becomes a debate. Either man has no impact on the environment, relatively negligible. There's such larger forces which determine the future state of our planet that whatever man does is negligible, so we don't even need to worry about it. The flip side is, well, of course man has an impact, but it's always a negative impact, an unnatural impact. And so there goes the debate. And for most people, they say, okay, we've got to pick a side. These are two clearly very different views about what man does, two very different views about how we should think about infrastructure, for example, think about economic policy, for example. But what's the reality? And this is the tragedy of the whole thing, is that, in fact, both of those sides of the aisle, so to speak, are expressing the exact same view about the nature of man. Because fundamentally, they both are expressing a very pessimistic view about man. Either man is an insignificant nothing, who can never go against the power of, whatever their image is of God, or the power of cosmic forces or whatever. Or man is a disease, man is a parasite, everything man does is unnatural, is a violator of Mother Gaia. But fundamentally, they're both saying the same thing about man. Man really isn't anything special or necessary in the universe. Now, this is something that I want to address because that captures the tragedy of where we are today. The fight now is around moving in the population the proper view of what really is man's role in the universe. Who is man? Or, I like as Lyndon LaRouche once put it, what is God that man is in his image? Or we might better say, what is the nature of our universe such that it's susceptible to change through the influence of the activity of the creative mind of man? Now, one thing I want to just present in the context of this NWAPA conference as a kind of pedagogical exploration of the kinds of questions that we need to take on, the kinds of questions that we'll be facing as we move forward with the NWAPA project, are, for example, what sort of influence will NWAPA have on the oceans. You know, something that often is neglected in the discussion, or if it does come up in the discussion, it's one of these two views that I discussed earlier. We're going to destroy the oceans, pollute the oceans, change them, whatever. Something I started to look at was the phenomenon of the generation in the oceans of electrical currents. That people know we have saline water, our oceans, salt water, and that then creates the conditions where you have ions of both sodium and chlorine. Yes. And so you get this condition where you get positive and negative ions of these two elements. And because of, there's a lot of science involved, but because of the Lorentz forces that are created as these currents move through the geomagnetic field, you then get created in the oceans electric currents. Now, as people who have any kind of background in electrical engineering or just played around with electricity and magnetism know that whenever you get a moving electric current, you also get produced perpendicular to it a magnetic field. And so there's been some research done looking at what is some of the other effects that are generated through the movement of the ocean currents through the geomagnetic field. And so what you get is the generation of not only electric currents, but then secondary magnetic fields because of the movement of water through the primary magnetic field. Which is interesting, something which is often not thought about. That in fact, our oceans are producing a magnetic field that then couples and interacts with the primary geomagnetic field of the planet Earth. Now, is that something in and of itself that we look at? Well, if you start to then move out and investigate, well, what really are we talking about whenever we're talking about our oceans or the creation of electric currents and magnetic fields here? Well, you're seeing that that's now coupled with not just our own magnetic field, but that's then coupled with things like the ionosphere, the plasmasphere, things like the Van Allen radiation belts, which are these other structures that sort of envelope what we typically think of as Earth. And these are structures of energetic ions, things in the ionosphere. These are things like highly energetic plasmas in the Van Allen belts. We have two belts, an inner one and an outer one, which are largely made up of, I think the inner one is largely positive and the outer one is largely negative elements that come in through cosmic radiation. These things are then constantly in flux and change through the activity of the sun. Magnetic storms of the sun, the 27-day cycle of rotation of the sun. So then the sun, through its activity, through its electromagnetic activity, is then acting on and influencing these other electromagnetic structures which are coupled with what typically we think of as the Earth, but which actually constitute the main body of the Earth, so to speak, if you sort of change your view beyond just the sort of the static view of matter, as we typically think about it, and now get a view of the Earth as something more than just the hard material substance, but now think about the total electromagnetic environment which constitutes the functions of the Earth. That's now in constant interaction and constant change under the influence of both processes on Earth and processes happening in the sun, which themselves are then interacting with all kinds of other cosmic activity, cosmic ray activity, the constant pumping into our cosmic environment from things like the Crab Nebula or other nebulae, which are exploding and sending all kinds of newly created activity into our region. And so you start to get a very different idea of what's the actual environment into which we're acting. Whenever we talk about intervening into the environment, are we simply talking about intervening into the forested areas or into a desert or into an ocean? Should we not think about intervening into a much larger galactic process? And so now whenever we say, okay, what are the effects of Nawapa going to be? Are they simply going to be effects on Earth per se? Or are we actually intervening into a much larger dynamic process? And so, for example, what you get is this. As we've talked about, a large portion, about 120 million acre-feet of water are to be diverted from the Alaska region, from the Yukon, Mackenzie rivers, down through the entire Nawapa system. So that's a lot of, 20% of the fresh water annually that flows into the sea up there. So we're going to be taking 20% of that fresh water from that area. Well, inevitably, that has the potential to change the salinity level of that region. Well, there's certain talk about, well, that might have an influence on the fishing and other things. Well, it also has an influence on affecting things like temperature and salinity levels. Two factors with both contribute to the conductivity of the oceans in that region. So not only are we possibly affecting what typically people would think about, but we have the ability that we may be possibly intervening in affecting things like the salinity levels of the ocean, and hence the conductivity and consequently the magnetic characteristics of the currents in that region. What kind of effect does that have then in its coupled relationship with the geomagnetic field, with other aspects of the electromagnetic environment in the area? As we start to think about, one proposal has been to set up a certain kind of damming process across the Bering Strait, where we could actually control the flow of currents into the Arctic region. So again, we'd actually start to control the flow of the currents, of the water currents, which consequently will affect the rate of generation of the electric currents, which consequently affects potentially the change in the electromagnetic environment of that area, which then might have other kinds of global implications. So now you're thinking about intervening into something very different than what typically people think about when they think about man's effects on nature. That we're intervening into a process which is much more dynamic and much more complex, and is in fact coupled with a very large and complex cosmic process. And then you look at it and, we're talking about very subtle changes in these things. Very subtle changes in what kind of effect it might have on the strength of the magnetic field. Very subtle changes in what kind of effect it could have on the electromagnetic environment. But those subtle changes, in fact, are precisely the kinds of changes which can have long-term implications. Now, for people who haven't seen, we've presented some videos on the website, LPAC website. One in particular that Mr. LaRouche has referenced recently, and which I recommend people to look at if they haven't seen it, is the one of what's known as the Extraterrestrial Imperative Part 2. And in there we go through and present some of the correlations between large cosmic cycles and evolutionary processes on Earth. The fact that the movement of the Earth around the sun and the movement of our solar system through the galaxy, that's moving in and out of the galactic arms of our spiral galaxy. It's bobbing up and down through the galactic plane. And they correlated evolutionary changes, extinction cycles, and also biodiversity cycles here on Earth with the movement through the galactic plane and movement through the spiral arms, to effectively demonstrate that what seem like very weak changes in the cosmic environment, very subtle change, not something you're going to notice on your daily perception of things, but very subtle changes in the amount of cosmic radiation impinging on the Earth is directly correlated with directed changes in evolution. Now, there hasn't been a lot presented as to the real causal mechanism of this. Exactly how does cosmic radiation affect evolutionary change? That's something which is sort of on our plate as a problem to be solved and investigated. But it starts to open the door to say, well, there's something much more happening here. There's a much larger and dynamic process at work on Earth and in our understanding of life on Earth than what we had typically thought of. You know, it's not just a simple survival of the fittest. It's not just a simple adaptation to some localized environmental change. But there's a galactic process at work which is having a definite and directed influence on the way life evolves and develops here on Earth. So, in that same way of thinking about these very subtle types of changes, we have to think about things in those terms when we talk about Milwaukee. When we talk about how we might be influencing, even in very subtle ways, the electromagnetic environment of our planet through our intervention into the water cycle, through our intervention into changing the flows of currents, changing the flow, changing the salinity levels. Or maybe acting on life itself to affect life's ability to affect the electromagnetic environment. Another thing that's come up that relates to this is that some new studies are being done which indicate that about a whole 1/3 of the energy that's involved in creating the currents and movement of water in the oceans is attributed to living processes. That it's not simply tidal pulls from the moon, it's not simply wind, it's not sort of the typical mechanical forces that we associate, or pressure differentials, changes in temperature differentials that we typically associate with what causes the flow of currents or the activity of movement of water in the oceans. That plays a part. But now we're saying a whole 1/3 of the energy that contributes to the movement of the current, the movement of water in the oceans, is attributed to living processes, right? The movement of the fish, the movement of the migration of whales, the movement, they did studies on jellyfish. They sort of mapped the flow of the water as a function of the movement of jellyfish through the oceans. And so we see that life itself is actually acting to affect its own environment in a very definite way. Because, as I indicated, it's the movement of the currents which can have an effect on determining certain aspects of the electromagnetic environment of the ocean. Well, there's a number of things which also depend on that, say, magnetic field for things like migration. There's indication that whales and other things use the magnetic field for migration. And so you start to see there's this very dynamic relationship between living processes, living activity, the electromagnetic environment, all of which is coupled to a very large cosmic process, cosmic radiation, changes in the sun. That's the kind of process we're intervening into with Milwaukee. And that's the way we need to start to think about this. How do we actually intervene to shape and determine the direction of processes on this planet as a whole? Both in terms of our immediate needs, but also in terms of long-term evolutionary processes. Now, one might ask, why should we think that we're entitled to do such things? How do we know that whenever we do act in this way that the effects produced are going to be good? Well, there's no mathematical formula that's going to give that to you. There's no mathematical formula which I can write out that I can prove that whenever we do X, Y, and Z, we're going to have A, B, and C effects, and those are good effects. We can measure it in money terms or whatever we sort of all agree to as a good thing. Well, if you all agree that A, B, and C are good, well, then we can say this is a good effect. We have different opinions, and we'll have different opinions whether or not those are good effects. But the reality is there is no formula. You don't know exactly what's going to be the effect of man's activity at this level. But what do we know? We know that the universe is a good place. We know that man, when he acts according to the laws of the universe, is doing the good. What kind of a universe would it be that it was susceptible to man changing it, but that those changes were always to the negative? I mean, that'd be a pretty cruel kind of existence. To say, okay, you live in an environment where everything you do affects the environment, but always in the negative, always to the bad. And you're going to be instilled with an impulse to be creative. You're going to be instilled with an impulse to do things, to create change. But everything you do is always going to be to the detriment of your own existence. It'd be a very Nietzschean kind of universe. But what's the reality? If you look at the history of human civilization, you look at the history of economic development, as Mr. LaRouche has documented time and time again, you see that, in fact, when man acts with the right intention, when man says, I'm going to act with the intention to do good for my fellow human being, I'm going to act with the intention to create a better condition of life for my children, for my grandchildren, that despite the fact that I don't know exactly what the effects of my action are going to be, that when man acts with that intention, the effects are always lawful. They're always good in the eyes of the universe itself. And that's the idea that must be communicated to the population, to ourselves here. That man is a necessary and integral part of this universe. That the universe exists in a way that is susceptible to man intervening and acting on it, to the effect of creating conditions for an even higher and greater potential for man to continue to do good, to do works, to do greater works for the future. And that's where we are now. We find ourselves in a tragic circumstance. Civilization is facing potential elimination through hunger, through disease, through lack of development, through war. And to the extent that people continue to sort of fight according to this false paradigm, like I brought up in the beginning, is man a destroyer of nature, or is man irrelevant to nature? To the extent that we argue and act according to that false paradigm, we are living out a tragic existence. And that's what you find. That's what people often don't get in real classical tragedy. You sort of see and you're like, well, as Lynn always brings up, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy? Or you got one kingdom versus another kingdom. You got this family versus that family. You got this guy's acting one way and it seems to contradict this other guy. You always look, well, who's the good guy here? Which royal house should I align with? Which character is the good one here? Is it the conspirators who killed Caesar, or is it Mark Antony and those who were behind Caesar? And you're always looking for, who do I line up with in this, of these two sides? But what's the reality? Both sides are wrong. Both sides are insane. The whole culture, regardless of what seems to be contradictory opinions and actions they have, are all bound by the same tragic flaws, some tragic idea about the nature of man, some wrong idea about man's relationship to the universe, man's relationship to man. And that's what constitutes the tragedy. It's bound, the entire of the human action in that drama is bound by non-universal ideas, ideas which are contradictory to the universe itself. And that's where we find ourselves now. As a Tea Party versus, the liberals, whatever. That's insane. The extent you line up on one side or the other, you've just signed your own death certificate. That's tragic. And that's what we have to communicate and get across. That in this time of existential crisis, we've got a program, a NWAPA program, who presents a solution not just in terms of what it can provide for bringing water to the great American desert, to the fact that it can create the conditions for growing abundant amounts of food. But what it really provides, it provides a change in identity for the nation and for the planet. An identity which says, my life is committed to the future. My life is committed to the betterment of mankind. That's the kind of paradigm which can get us out of this tragic circumstance we find ourselves in now. And it's precisely because NWAPA embodies that identity, that idea of man as a co-creator of the universe, that the idea couldn't be killed. Mr. LaRue says that there's an idea which was able to hold on through 40 plus years, virtually written out of the books, but now is coming back today. That's indicative of the fact that it's an idea which is sort of embedded into the fabric of the universe because it's truthful. And a truthful idea cannot be killed. It might go dormant for a while, it might lay fallow for a while, but it can't be killed. And that's what we have with Nawapa. Its time has come, and it really is up to all of us to make sure that the population of this country and of the world realize what time it is. And so I'll just leave there and see if there's any questions.
What kinds of factors, speaking generally, that will affect the Nawapa project? As far as, human behavior, environmental factors, and what kinds of things, like, I don't know, like, specifically.
Yeah, I think a lot of that will be gone through the course of the afternoon today. But one of the main things is that, one, like I said, we don't know exactly what the total effect is going to be. It really is, as maybe Mr. Tang will discuss later, the beauty of Nawapa is that it creates the conditions where we have sort of the largest laboratory ever created. That we don't know exactly what the effects are going to be, but we're creating the conditions to have a global sort of laboratory to test fundamental principles about the relationship of man to the biosphere. Now, what we do know is that by bringing this 120 million acre-feet of water down per year, that in general, we have possibly the ability to irrigate initially anywhere between 25 and 50 million acres of land for food growth, for generating new forests, all kinds of uses. One of the things we're looking into is what kind of effect will this have on generating either local and possibly global changes in weather systems, weather patterns. To where we could create new weather systems, such as you start to cycle that water by bringing it into a rain cycle. By changing the course of the flow of the water, like I said, you're affecting things like the salinity level in one area, maybe lowering it in one area, raising it in one area, maybe lowering it in another area. So there's a lot of impacts of that sort, which we don't know exactly what all the effects are going to be. But if we're optimistic about the nature of man and man's mind, we know that it has the potential to be good and in the positive direction, and any sort of other detrimental effects that might spin off from it. We also know that man is capable of addressing them. And in doing it, the fact that we're going to be educating scientists, creating industry, creating all kinds of new potential, we're also going to be generating an abundance of creative, engaged minds, which will be able to tackle and address any kind of problems that might come up with it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cody, as she describes, one of the effects of doing it, it occurs to me, what will the effects of not doing it be?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that's something I think, you want to see the effects of not doing it is just step outside here. Talk to someone on the street. One, we know the physical effects of not doing it, where we are running out of water. That's a real problem. You look at things. At one point, I'd done some study on the Ogallala Aquifer, and something that became striking was that a number of these farmers in Texas were running into a situation where, as the aquifer goes lower and lower and lower, the cost of pumping the water goes up exponentially. And so you're running into this situation where, because of the drop of the Ogallala, the farmers were no longer tapping, it was no longer economically viable to tap the water out of the Ogallala to grow food. And so you have all these farmers starting to move towards dry farming, cotton farming, things which aren't really of the quality of abundant food production that we need right now to meet the demands of a growing, hungry population. So, were we not to go through with NWAPA, we face major starvation around the planet. You know, we face water shortages in cities. I mean, you look at just how insane things are getting. Where, like in the Imperial Valley, farmers, some of the most productive, technologically advanced farmers that, you know, was once the breadbasket of the world, are now selling their water rights to San Diego, are foregoing farming because it's now more profitable to just let that water flow right past them into San Diego so that the city of San Diego can meet its sort of expansion housing bubble needs. And so you see the sort of insanity of the paradigm that's taking over. And then you look at the physical effects of it, where whenever Mr. LaRouche talks about an economic collapse, there is the financial collapse, the blowout of the bubble, the crashing of the dollar, you know, what's going on with the blowing out the euro system. But behind that is something much more stark, which is the physical collapse that's underway, the collapse of infrastructure. You know, if we don't get NWAPA, what is going to actually revive the so-called Rust Belt of America? What's going to be the impetus to put those engineers, many of which are, you know, in the last phase of their life, back to work? So you face the potential where if we don't go with NWAPA now, we're going to lose the last of the skilled engineers, scientists, and people who can actually address these fundamental physical problems, such that you wait too long, you find yourself in a position where no one is actually alive anymore who knows how to address these problems, engineering problems, water problems, farming problems, what have you. So yeah, if we don't do NWAPA, it is a dark age. That's what we're facing.
Hi, my name is Nick Walsh. I work with LaRouche PAC. Toronto and I just finished a trip into Arizona, into the Tucson area. And we were meeting with farmers, engineers, hydrologists, all kinds, even space NASA people on this last trip. It's wild how much the entire culture and economy of that region, which is really a microcosm of this whole western region of the country, is determined by this water crisis. I mean, you have entire departments in universities and every different special sector, where they have huge departments devoted to the science of farming and developing civilization in conditions where there is not the right amount of water to do that. And so, but the problem we ran into is everyone has settled into this discussion of how do we survive, because this is the way that the situation is, this is how the biosphere is. So now they're doing amazing things. Some of these guys have amazing ideas of how to produce lots of food, for example, with no water. It's quite interesting. But these guys all wanted to meet with us, and really were excited about what you just said. We could multiply the amount of water in Arizona by 12 times if we just thought about bringing it down from Alaska. Why didn't we think of that? Now, there's a lot of debate. I'm not saying that everyone's told. There's a political fight, and all these questions come up. But this is what we used to do as a nation. I mean, this nature, this idea of man intelligently transforming the earth to increase population and living standards at the same time is the alternative to doing that is just a fixed shrinking box. Now, the question I had, because we ran into a number of space people, NASA people, who were bringing up this space cosmic radiation, the galactic processes that are affecting things on Earth. Because the space question is the same kind of thing. It's an unknown domain. Another issue on foreign planets is there's not a lot of water up there. You know? There's not a lot of water on the moon that I know of. There's not a lot of flowing water on Mars. But we were meeting with a couple of these NASA folks who were very interested in the NWAPA from the standpoint of terraforming, how you cultivate agriculture in extremely dry areas. Some of these guys were working on this, of how to do this on the moon, how to create greenhouses on the moon that would begin to create and simulate a biosphere up there.
Right.
How do you think we should unify that issue, that frontier, with the frontier of Nawapa?
Well, I think one of the biggest problems right now has been what Obama has done to the manned space program. Once you kill the manned space program, you really neuter science. Because what's occurring, no longer, we've been to a couple of these conferences in the last months or so, these different NASA-type conferences, heliophysics conferences, and once you accept the idea that we're not going to put man into space, you start to then compromise with exactly what we can do, because the questions change. When you say we're going to put man on the moon, or we're going to colonize Mars, the kinds of questions you have to address then are very different. You have to think about what's the relationship between the geomagnetic field and life. What's the relationship of our particular gravitational field and life? What role does things like the atmosphere and the relationship of the atmosphere to cosmic radiation play on life? So you start to say, we're going to go to the moon, we're going to go to Mars. You have to think about, well, what's the broader environment that is necessary to sustain human life? We don't think about it on Earth. Most people don't, in their daily activity, think about what's the effect of the gravitational field on me right now. They don't go out and look, how's the gravitational field today, to determine what their daily activities are. They don't think about, what's the flux in the magnetic field going to be a week from now as I start to plan my vacation to Florida or something. Right? They think about weather, things which seem to be immediately impacting them. But now when you say, hey, we're going to go colonize Mars, you have to think, well, gee, Mars doesn't have a sustained magnetic field. It has a 1/3 gravity effect that we have here on Earth. It doesn't have the atmosphere we have. It has a very different electromagnetic environment. Well, gee, that might have some consequences for our ability to sustain life there. So now the questions become very different. But once you cut that off, once you say we're not doing that, now it's, things get much more theoretical. All we need to do is throw some satellites up there and sort of look at things. Let's look at how the magnetic field looks on different planets. Let's look at, different redshift characteristics, and all of which is very interesting. But because you've eliminated the necessity to sustain man in that environment, you've changed the questions, and you've changed the level of investigation, which then plays back on your understanding here on Earth. Because it's through our understanding of what's required to sustain man out there that we understand how these processes affect our activity here on Earth. We start to think about, hey, how would we create a Nawapa-type system on Mars that we get insights into what we're doing here on Earth, weather systems, how the total water cycle works. You start to think in planetary terms, the way a real NASA scientist does. They think in planetary terms. And so I think one of the big things is to get back to waging this fight of the necessity, both in terms of what it means for the imagination of man, but then what it means as the driver for science, to get back to really pushing and making the forefront of activity manned missions to the moon, back to the moon, to Mars, and beyond. And then we start to look at Nawapa in that context of saying, well, Nawapa now isn't just an investigation of processes here on Earth. Nawapa now becomes an investigation of getting, in a much more friendly environment, getting a deeper understanding of how a global water cycle works, of how a global relationship between the water cycle, the electromagnetic environment, the gravitational field, how all that works here, because we need to know and master it if we're going to get those conditions for life on another planet. And so it really changes even your idea of Nawapa here. It's not just a survival thing. It does become, like I was saying, it becomes a laboratory for experiment and investigation. But a lot of that is really driven and pulled by the drive to get man off this planet and realize the extraterrestrial imperative.
Hello, my name is Rick Linder. I build nuclear power plants for a living and do heavy industrial construction. I'm wondering what the timetable for this is. You run into the problem of people's skill sets erode if they only work 1 or 2 months out of the year. welders specifically, they tend to blow welds if their hand isn't in it all the time. I worked at the Canadian Sand-Tar project, and they had to import foreign labor to get the work done because everybody's skill sets were bad, and the welders kept blowing welds. They had to import people from China, from people from the Philippines, and the like. So I'm wondering what the timetable is. It's imperative. The workforce skills tend to erode.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different sides to it. One thing that Mr. LaRouche, and he's the expert on this, so maybe you want to send in a message to him. But one thing he's talked about is that at the point that the financial system itself blows, if we haven't brought in the Glass-Steagall, if we haven't moved towards a credit system where we're now generating credit to get this project moving, you run into a real chaos factor where the financial system blows, you haven't acted appropriately to replace it, or you haven't preempted it with the bankruptcy of your organization. You now find yourself in a chaotic situation where just the ability of governments and society to hold itself together, even at the dysfunctional level that we have it now, is lost. At that point, it's hard to say what then is required to sort of pull society back together at the point that it's been completely fractured and shattered. So on one level, there's the immediate necessity to move on this thing because the financial system is hanging by a thread. It could blow any moment now. As Mike was bringing up earlier, the situation in Europe with the collapse of the EU system, the austerity being pushed, that's only going to, the actions they're taking are to stave off the crisis for maybe a week, a couple days. But when it goes, if there's not a policy in place, if we haven't created the conditions to either preempt it with a bankruptcy of your organization or to move at the point of disintegration with LaRouche's plan, all bets are off. It's chaos. Now, that aside, we also, as you're indicating, we're running into a very small timetable for implementing just from the physical standpoint. That as the workforce is aging, as you're saying, you start to lose skill sets as you don't use it. The plant and equipment itself is starting to crumble. The infrastructure required to just even feed into the manufacturing sector. The water, a lot of water goes into industry and manufacturing. A lot of power goes into it. So that stuff is already starting to crumble to where we're actually going to be losing the physical basis to a certain extent, even get the initial startup going for Nawaka, because you've lost the skilled set of engineers, you've lost the actual, even just the dilapidated foundation we have now to get the industry and things up and running. So I would say, one, immediately the timetable is we've got to move now to get this thing through. But in physical terms, maybe you have slightly longer than tomorrow. You might have a couple of weeks ahead before you actually start to run into a physical existential crisis. But yeah, it's immediate. We really don't have time to hesitate on it. So yeah, I think it's now. We have to act on it now before it really does become both politically and then physically too late. And the political side, the political too late is sort of competing with the physical point of no return on, which is going to catch us first. Do you have a question? Okay.
Well, I can ask a question a little later.
Oh, okay. Well, I just want to say I'm not a scientist. I'm a certified public accountant and history. So it's a completely different perspective. I'm in history. I remember when this country had something called Manifest Destiny. We were a little country of 13 states after the revolution, and we went across within a space of, let's say, 100 and odd years, 150 years, to go from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the North to the South, but still, and of course we violated every treaty with the Indians, but that aside, but with progress. The rail system to go across the country. there's something been lost here. And I know that the Glass-Steagall is immediate, because without it, without the separation of the banking system, it's never going to happen. Now the thing is, what I'm really disturbed about is what are our prospects of getting this thing through very soon, if not now, because it doesn't look as though I mean, Lynn is going to have to just come through. It seems that way with muscle.
Well, this is a subjective question. That's the question. What you're posing is the question we all have to pose to ourselves. Because it's not, the prospects lie in what we do to make sure that it does happen. It's in what we do in our daily organizing and talking to people and moving the population. Because as you're pointing out, the real problem is that the population culturally has lost a sense of its connectedness to history and a connectedness to the future. And that's the fight. But with the NWAPA, it gives you a way to encapsulate both the historical process that brought us here and a sense of the future of where we can be and where we must go. So it's really a subjective question on what we're going to do to organize and make this thing happen. But we have to, we just got the cutoff sign, so thank you.